Roberts told reporters this week that her marriage to Lyle Lovett has been over for some time. The key moment, she said, came when she realized that she was Julia Roberts and that she was married to Lyle Lovett. The results are in for 1995, and once again, Microsoft CEO Bill Gates is the richest man in America. Gates says that he is grateful for his huge financial success, but it still makes him sad when he looks around and sees other people who have any money whatsoever. In a brilliant move during closing arguments, Simpson attorney Johnny Cochran put on the knit cap prosecutors say O.J. wore the night he committed the murders. Although O.J. may have hurt his case when he suddenly blurted out, hey, easy with that. That's my lucky stabbing hat. And in music news, number one on the college charts this summer was Better Than Ezra. And at number two, Ezra.
Good morning. It's Tuesday, Ayn Rand Tuesday, November the 28th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have the military shorts, strategies of war, pirates, and Ayn Rand, the next part of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now some military shorts.
A few days ago, the first Abrams tanks arrived on the territory of Ukraine and will soon enter the tank brigades. In total, the United States will transfer 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. How many have already been transferred is unknown. The U.S. presidential administration is also considering providing Ukraine with 30 more such tanks. In addition, tank shells with depleted uranium were also supplied, which provide increased armor-piercing power. Since, for example, the same Leopard 2 tanks have already proven themselves in battle and are very effective, the Abrams will undoubtedly strengthen Ukraine's offensive operations and bring closer victory in the war against Russia. When the Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane in 1960, it was a nightmare for U.S. military leaders that threatened to change the course of the Cold War. But for the pilot himself, it was simply a matter of survival. Flying at an altitude of 70,000 feet, he had been gathering intelligence over the Soviet Union when he was suddenly rocked by an SA-2 missile. In an instant, the sky around him turned orange, and as his plane went into a downward spiral, all he could think about was ejecting. Unfortunately, the force of the spin pressed him against his canopy, making it impossible to eject safely. So, he jumped. After parachuting to the ground, he was captured by the Soviets and interrogated. But the U.S. had no idea he had survived, and quickly came up with an elaborate cover story to explain the U-2 overflight. When the truth came out, the incident caused a major rift between the U.S. and Soviet Union and derailed talks of a peaceful coexistence between the two superpowers. Submarines equipped with missile capabilities, particularly ballistic missile submarines, are designed to operate in various environments, including icy conditions. Have you ever seen why they punch through the ice? This training program conducted by the U.S. Navy for surfacing through ice in the Arctic is known as the ICE exercise, or ICEX. When a submarine wants to launch the missile, it may use its ice-breaking capabilities to create a suitable opening in the ice before initiating the missile launch sequence. This allows the submarine to breach the ice and provide a clear path for the missile's trajectory. The ice-breaking capability of the submarine's hull and its powerful propulsion systems enable it to exert pressure on the ice and create a hole or open water area through which the missile can be launched. Then, surfacing through ice allows submarines to establish communication with other surface vessels, aircraft, or shore-based facilities.
Hamas says it didn't expect such a strong response from the U.S., with a senior member of the group telling the Financial Times an Israeli response, yes, we expected that, but what we're seeing now is the entrance of the U.S. into the battle, and this we didn't count on. And that, alluding to how the U.S.'s two carriers have restrained Hamas's allies from fully entering the war with Israel as Hamas expected them to. Jordan has also asked the United States to deploy patriots in its country to bolster its defense. And this is an anti-Semitic mob of hundreds stormed an airport and its tarmac in Russia looking for Jewish people who they claim were on a flight from Tel Aviv. And earlier in the day, the New York Times reports that hundreds gathered outside of a hotel after rumors that it was, quote, filled with Jews. And Russia has blamed Ukraine for its own people forming anti-Semitic mobs. Follow to stay in the loop.
On March 8, 1996, the Third Taiwan Crisis commenced, and Chinese missiles began landing seriously close to Taiwan. The U.S. president authorized the U.S. Navy to respond on the exact same day. A Ticonderoga-class cruiser was based off the southern coast of Taiwan, where American forces were already present. As they made their way back to Japan from the Philippines, the aircraft carrier USS Independence CV-62 and her carrier Group 5 positioned themselves on the eastern side of the island. Following the missile tests, the USS Nimitz, operating in the Persian Gulf, was given the order to steam into the western Pacific at top speed. The Aegis cruiser USS Port Royal, the Spruance-class guided missile destroyers USS Oldendorf and Callahan, the Oliver Hazard Perry-class guided missile frigate USS Ford, and the Los Angeles-class submarine USS Portsmouth SSN 707, made up this even more potent carrier battle group. This mighty American CBG sailed through the Taiwan Strait when Beijing declared a simulated amphibious strike. The PLA was powerless to stop the American warships that were close to its shoreline.
The gun that made Navy SEALs famous, Mark 18 Mod 0, has a Knight's Armament NT4 silencer on it, a PEC 5-day laser on it from L3. I bet you didn't know those existed. Old school Surefire, broom handle, the Aimpoint Comp M2. Here we go, baby. Old school Navy SEAL. Woo! That baby's fast. You said it was obsolete? Shoot, man, it ain't obsolete at all. There's no reason that you still ain't fighting with these today. As a matter of fact, they actually still are. You just never see them because it's not Gucci, and Call of Duty didn't tell you it was awesome.
The weather was poor as the A-10 pilot dove to attack an Iraqi radar, but the pilot, refusing to give up, decided to make one last fateful pass so he could drop two 500-pound Mark 82 bombs on the target. As he dove in, his wingman lost sight of him. Seconds later, his A-10 suddenly shook violently as it was struck by a surface-to-air missile. When the pilot saw the damage, a cold chill ran up his spine. Hydraulic lines were poking out of the wing, flames were sprouting up everywhere, and the leading edge had a gaping hole in it. The crippled aircraft then began losing altitude and speed, which made refueling a challenge. As he approached the waiting KC-10 tanker, it had to drop its landing gear at 6,000 feet just to match him. But his problems didn't end there. The right wing was so badly damaged that he worried it would fall off when he lowered his landing gear. Thankfully, despite shredding a tire as he touched down, he pulled off a flawless no-flap landing.
The B-1B Lancer bomber, a venerable aircraft that has been in service for over 30 years, has been reborn as a serious beast thanks to a new upgrade program called BEAST, B-1 Embracing Agile Scheduling Team. The BEAST program is designed to modernize the B-1B avionics systems and give it new capabilities that will make it even more lethal and effective in combat. One of the most significant upgrades under the BEAST program is the addition of a new identification friend or foe system. This new system will allow the B-1B to more easily identify friendly and enemy aircraft, which is critical for avoiding fratricide in combat. The BEAST program also includes upgrades to the B-1B Link 16 tactical data communications capability, secure communications systems, defensive avionics system, and mass data storage capacity. The upgraded defensive avionics system will make the B-1B more survivable in contested airspace, and the increased mass data storage capacity will allow it to carry more detailed intelligence and targeting information into combat.
This is the story of how 35 planes once landed on an aircraft carrier at night during a raging typhoon. It was 1972 when the USS Midway, operating in the Gulf of Tonkin, had launched a mix of 35 F-4s, A-6s, and A-7s that morning. But before they could make it back, a typhoon rolled in, and the planes, having completed their combat missions, were running low on fuel and didn't have enough to make it to the nearest land base. That meant the carrier, which by this time was being thrown around by 60-foot waves, was their only option. To make things worse, the sun had already set, meaning not only would the returning pilots have to land in 100-mile-per-hour winds on a bobbing deck, they'd have to do it in complete blackness. As the first plane came in, the pilot couldn't see the landing area lights and could only hope his tailhook would catch the arresting wire. He managed to catch the wire, but the harrowing process then had to be repeated 34 more times. Amazingly, every single plane landed safely. The C-130 Hercules has been serving military forces around the world since the 1950s. It's renowned for its versatility, capable of executing tactical missions, airlifting troops and cargo, and even performing aerial refueling. But why this powerful aircraft uses propellers instead of jet engines? This is beyond what you think. One of the primary reasons the C-130 uses propellers is efficiency. This efficiency is particularly valuable during tactical operations, where the C-130's ability to take off and land on shorter runways becomes crucial for military missions worldwide. Afterward, when compared to jets, propeller-driven aircraft generally show better fuel economy and are more economical to own, operate, and maintain. Although jets offer unmatched speed, a longer range, and the capacity to travel to great heights. Then, in terms of maintenance and operational costs, propeller-driven planes generally prove to be more economical than jets.
Operation Phantom Fury.
And there you go. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we're picking up where we left off with the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene.
The British were clever rulers. Gandhi understood that if nonviolence were to work, it would have to be extremely strategic, demanding much thought and planning. He went so far as to call nonviolence a new way of waging war. To promote any value, even peace and pacifism, you must be willing to fight for it and to aim at results, not simply the good, warm feeling that expressing such ideas might bring you. The moment you aim for results, you are in the realm of strategy. War and strategy have an inexorable logic. If you want or desire anything, you must be ready and able to fight for it. Others will argue that war and strategy are primarily matters that concern men, particularly those who are aggressive or among the power elite. The study of war and strategy, they will say, is a masculine, elitist, and repressive pursuit, a way for power to perpetuate itself. Such an argument is dangerous nonsense. In the beginning, strategy indeed belonged to a select few: a general, his staff, the king, a handful of courtiers. Soldiers were not taught strategy, for that would not have helped them on the battlefield. Besides, it was unwise to arm one's soldiers with the kind of practical knowledge that could help them to organize a mutiny or rebellion. The era of colonialism took this principle further. The indigenous peoples of Europe's colonies were conscripted into the Western armies and did much of the police work, but even those who rose to the upper echelons were rigorously kept ignorant of knowledge of strategy, which was considered far too dangerous for them to know. To maintain strategy and the arts of war as a branch of specialized knowledge is actually to play into the hands of the elites and repressive powers, who like to divide and conquer. If strategy is the art of getting results, of putting ideas into practice, then it should be spread far and wide, particularly among those who have been traditionally kept ignorant of it, including women. In the mythologies of almost all cultures, the great gods of war are women, including Athena of ancient Greece. A woman's lack of interest in strategy and war is not biological, but social and perhaps political. Instead of resisting the pull of strategy and the virtues of rational warfare, or imagining that it is beneath you, it is far better to confront its necessity. Mastering the art will only make your life more peaceful and productive in the long run, for you will know how to play the game and win without violence. Ignoring it will lead to a life of endless confusion and defeat. The following are 6 fundamental ideals you should aim for in transforming yourself into a strategic warrior in daily life. Look at things as they are, not as your emotions color them. In strategy, you must see your emotional responses to events as a kind of disease that must be remedied. Fear will make you overestimate the enemy and act too defensively. Anger and impatience will draw you into rash actions that will cut off your options. Overconfidence, particularly as a result of success, will make you go too far. Love and affection will blind you to the treacherous maneuvers of those apparently on your side. Even the subtlest gradations of these emotions can color the way you look at events. The only remedy is to be aware that the pull of emotion is inevitable, to notice it when it is happening, and to compensate for it. When you have success, be extra wary. When you are angry, take no action. When you are fearful, know you are going to exaggerate the dangers you face. War demands the utmost in realism, seeing things as they are. The more you can limit or compensate for your emotional responses, the closer you will come to this ideal. Judge people by their actions. The brilliance of warfare is that no amount of eloquence or talk can explain away a failure on the battlefield. A general has led his troops to defeat. Lives have been wasted, and that is how history will judge him. You must strive to apply this ruthless standard in your daily life, judging people by the results of their actions, the deeds that can be seen and measured, the maneuvers they have used to gain power. What people say about themselves does not matter. People will say anything. Look at what they have done. Deeds do not lie. You must also apply this logic to yourself. In looking back at a defeat, you must identify the things you could have done differently. It is your own bad strategies, not the unfair opponent, that are to blame for your failures. You are responsible for the good and bad in your life. As a corollary to this, look at everything other people do as a strategic maneuver, an attempt to gain victory. People who accuse you of being unfair, for example, who try to make you feel guilty, who talk about justice and morality, are trying to gain an advantage on the chessboard. Depend on your own arms. In the search for success in life, people tend to rely on things that seem simple and easy, or that have worked before. This could mean accumulating wealth, resources, a large number of allies, or the latest technology and the advantage it brings. This is being materialistic and mechanical. But true strategy is psychological, a matter of intelligence, not material force. Everything in life can be taken away from you, and generally will be at some point. Your wealth vanishes. The latest gadgetry suddenly becomes passé. Your allies desert you. But if your mind is armed with the art of war, there is no power that can take that away. In the middle of a crisis, your mind will find its way to the right solution. Having superior strategies at your fingertips will give your maneuvers irresistible force. As Sun Tzu says, being unconquerable lies with yourself. Worship Athena, not Ares. In the mythology of ancient Greece, the cleverest immortal of them all was the goddess Metis. To prevent her from outwitting and destroying him, Zeus married her, then swallowed her whole, hoping to incorporate her wisdom in the process. But Metis was pregnant with Zeus's child, the goddess Athena, who was subsequently born from his forehead. As befitting her lineage, she was blessed with the craftiness of Metis and the warrior mentality of Zeus. She was deemed by the Greeks to be the goddess of strategic warfare, her favorite mortal and acolyte being the crafty Odysseus. Ares was the god of war in its direct and brutal form. The Greeks despised Ares and worshipped Athena, who always fought with the utmost intelligence and subtlety. Your interest in war is not the violence, the brutality, the waste of lives and resources, but the rationality and pragmatism it forces on us, and the ideal of winning without bloodshed. The Ares figures of the world are actually quite stupid and easily misled. Using the wisdom of Athena, your goal is to turn the violence and aggression of such types against them, making their brutality the cause of their downfall. Like Athena, you are always one step ahead, making your moves more indirect. Your goal is to blend philosophy and war, wisdom and battle, into an unbeatable blend. Elevate yourself above the battlefield. In war, strategy is the art of commanding the entire military operation. Tactics, on the other hand, is the skill of forming up the army for battle itself and dealing with the immediate needs of the battlefield. Most of us in life are tacticians, not strategists. We become so enmeshed in the conflicts we face that we can think only of how to get what we want in the battle we are currently facing. To think strategically is difficult and unnatural. You may imagine you are being strategic, but in all likelihood you are merely being tactical. To have the power that only strategy can bring, you must be able to elevate yourself above the battlefield, to focus on your long-term objectives, to craft an entire campaign, to get out of the reactive mode that so many battles in life lock you into. Keeping your overall goals in mind, it becomes much easier to decide when to fight and when to walk away. That makes the tactical decisions of daily life much simpler and more rational. Tactical people are heavy and stuck in the ground. Strategists are light on their feet and can see far and wide. Spiritualize your warfare. Every day you face battles. That is the reality for all creatures in their struggle to survive. But the greatest battle of all is with yourself. Your weaknesses, your emotions, your lack of resolution in seeing things through to the end.
And that was the part 2 of the preface of the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, how SEAL Team 6 smoked some pirates.
The Navy SEALs clenched their fists as they heard Jessica Buchanan desperately pleading for her life. The American teacher had participated in a demining project in Somalia before being kidnapped by several pirates. Now she lay sick and starving somewhere in the desert, defenseless against the whims of her heavily armed captors. The operators of the famous SEAL Team 6 would do everything to save her. But one bad piece of news followed the next. Gale force winds would force the sailors to jump out of the aircraft at more than twice the wind speeds of what would have normally canceled the jump. On top of that, they were in the middle of a solar storm, which could block radio communications to support units for hours. The SEALs would have to prove that they were among the best before they even touched the ground. Any other mission would have been delayed by at least a day. But the warriors knew Jessica didn't have those 24 hours. And so, they donned their parachutes, checked their oxygen tanks, and then jumped into the unknown darkness, and one of the most daring hostage rescues ever. Jessica Buchanan was 32 years old and living with her husband in one of the safer areas of Somalia. Together with her Danish colleague, Paul Thisted, she worked for a large aid organization, educating children about the dangers of anti-personnel mines that were widespread throughout the country. On her next assignment, she had to travel dangerously close to the so-called Green Line, an invisible line behind which lay the areas controlled by Islamists. The security situation in the Horn of Africa was already tense as it was, with bomb attacks and small skirmishes between rival tribes occurring almost regularly. However, Jessica had not come to Africa to hide behind walls, so she decided to conduct the anti-mine training anyway. At first, everything seemed to go without incident. But on October 25th, 2011, the day of their return trip, everything was about to change for the two humanitarian workers. The first thing that struck Jessica as suspicious was her driver. Instead of their usual chauffeur, a completely unknown man was sitting in the Land Cruiser who was supposed to take them to the airport. Her Danish colleague, however, seemed to be in a hurry and climbed into the passenger seat unimpressed, which is why Jessica stopped worrying. Then, after only 10 minutes of driving, it happened. A massive car forced the convoy to an abrupt halt. Nearly 30 men with AK-47 assault rifles jumped out of several vehicles, banging on the Land Cruiser's windows and yelling orders in a language Jessica didn't understand. Before she could even realize what was happening to her, one of the pirates pointed his gun to her head while her security advisor was violently dragged from the vehicle. A heavily armed man sat down in the vacant seat and gave orders to Jessica's driver, who willingly hit the gas and showed who he was really working for. It wasn't long before they stopped again and switched vehicles amid loud shouting from the pirates. The whole thing seemed very well planned, although the kidnappers had obviously consumed too much khat, a plant common in Africa which acts similar to amphetamines. After the pirates stopped in the middle of nowhere, Jessica and Paul had to prepare their own execution, only to be sent back to the car just before their tragic end. The pirates didn't care at all about the lives of the relief workers, but in order to collect the highest possible ransom, they needed their hostages unharmed. For them, it was fun to mock the powerlessness of the West on the other side of the world. Jessica and Paul, meanwhile, were living their nightmare. They could do nothing, as they were at the mercy of the barbarians and didn't even know if anyone had noticed their disappearance. But Washington was not only aware of the abduction of the humanitarian workers, it had already initiated first countermeasures. Jessica's aid organization had notified the American embassy in Nairobi immediately after the assault, which in turn informed the FBI. From here, phone calls were made to family members to reassure them and dissuade them from acting rashly. Even before the end of the day, high-ranking officials briefed U.S. President Barack Obama, and while the pirates were preparing to contact authorities, Jessica Buchanan was already a top priority at the White House. Paul Thisted later recounted that the best thing that could have happened to him was to be kidnapped with an American. Both hostages and pirates were soon to find out what that meant. Almost 3 months later, Jessica was still in captivity. Good news was that she was still alive. Bad news was that despite slow negotiations, no agreement could be made for a ransom, as the pirates had even refused $1.5 million, enough money that each of them would be set up for at least 30 years. Every day, Jessica fought hunger, heat, and the constant fear that the kidnappers would harm her. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, a urinary tract infection had spread through her body, and in the worst-case scenario, it could be fatal. In a final video message to Western authorities, she joined Paul in begging for their lives and a quick payment of the ransom. Otherwise, she would either die from her infection or fall victim to the whims of pirates drugged with cod. That night, Jessica gazed up at the brightly lit starry sky and prayed. Unbeknownst to her, her prayers were answered when 10,000 miles away, 24 cell phones suddenly rang. The men picking up the phones had long beards and were covered with tattoos. Some of them had the stature of a bear, while others looked like hardened marathon runners. But they all had one thing in common: their aura of absolute calm, self-confidence, and professionalism. They were all part of the famous SEAL Team 6, who had just been alerted for a hostage rescue. Over the next few weeks, SEAL Team 6's Blue Squadron trained day and night to rescue Jessica, her pleading voice from the video message always in the back of their minds. The warriors had hunted gruesome men all over the world, but when it came to the lives of women and children, they were especially motivated. On January 25, 2012, the time had finally come. President Obama himself had given the green light for the hostage rescue. 24 of the best warriors the U.S. had to offer would risk their lives to try to free both hostages unharmed. Their plan was to parachute over Somalia and then approach the pirate camp on foot so as not to alert the enemy with loud noises. At the U.S. operations base in Djibouti, around 500 miles from Jessica's location, everything military-related which was useful in some way was gathered. At this point, the total operation cost was already well over $100 million. That was how much America was willing to spend to save just one citizen. With final preparations completed, the SEALs boarded their C-130 transport aircraft and took off for Mogadishu. Remarkably, the pilots themselves had only just arrived and had been on a 9-hour flight right before, but performed their job just like business as usual. All eyes, including those of the president, who was monitoring the operation via live feed, were now on the hostage rescue. As it turned out later, the kidnappers wanted to change their position on exactly this night, but had eaten spoiled meat and therefore ended up staying put. On the other side, however, a violent solar storm erupted, which hit the Earth's magnetic field so hard that radio waves, and thus radio communications with other support units, were disrupted. Meaning, in a worst-case scenario, no quick reaction force, no situation reports, and no close air support. On top of that, wind speeds were more than double what would have canceled a regular mission. But the rescue of Jessica Buchanan was not a regular mission, and every one of the 24 men on board was willing to take that extra risk. After about 3 hours in the air, the C-130 had reached their drop point. The SEALs rose from their seats, hooked up their oxygen tanks, and then dropped from more than 20,000 feet into the 40-knot wind. After only a few seconds of free fall, the operators had already reached 120 miles per hour, a speed which is normally achieved by competitive athletes in optimal conditions. Despite the absurd wind situation, the SEALs managed to land semi-cohesively, with a few runaways who were dragged across the savannah for hundreds of yards before separating from the parachute. Holding security for each other, the sailors put on their combat gear and wrapped up their chutes. From now on, they had to walk several miles through the more than 100-degree hot Somali night. After nearly an hour of silent marching, the sailors reached their last cover before irreversibly committing to the assault. They were now only 500 meters from the pirate camp. Along the way, they had changed direction several times to always have the wind in their faces, eliminating any possibility of being spotted early. Every little detail counted when it came to sneaking as close as possible to the enemy. A hostage rescue differs from normal combat mission in that the hostage's life is even more important than fighting the enemy. The SEALs would literally run through machine gun fire if it meant they could save Jessica. Their goal was to remain undetected for as long as possible, then speed was of the essence. As the 24 warriors began to move again, the longest hour of their lives was about to begin. They had long been within earshot of the pirates, and only night's darkness kept them from the attention of enemy guards.
As if in slow motion, one foot was silently placed forward, the weight shifted, and only then followed the next foot. An experienced SEAL named Justin Sheffield led the group. At his hand signal, the operators spread out far to the left and right to bring as many rifles forward as possible without walking into others' field of fire. Snipers positioned themselves on the outer flanks and monitored their comrades' actions. As the sailors moved forward in perfect unison, they could watch through their thermal scopes as the enemy sentries slowly became anxious and woke the other pirates. The SEALs quickened their pace, still perfectly steady. Sheffield aimed his laser at one of the Somali guards, and without having to say anything, his comrades did the same. The infrared beam was completely invisible to the pirates without night vision, but they sensed something moving in the darkness. With a loud clack, they racked their heavy PKM machine guns and got into position. The pirates pointed their weapons roughly in the direction from which they heard the sounds. The SEALs increased their pace once again, now less concerned with noise discipline than with closing the distance to the hostages before all hell broke loose. With a deafening noise, the pirates' machine gun kicked off and fired deadly 7.62 millimeter rounds at the operators, followed by several AK-47 assault rifles. The snipers had been waiting for just this moment and almost immediately silenced the enemy machine guns before seeking new targets. With surgical precision, the Navy SEALs returned fire while simultaneously fighting their way forward to find Jessica. In a similar hostage rescue, French special forces failed to overwhelm the hostiles quickly enough, resulting in the execution of the hostage. Each of the SEALs was prepared to do anything to avoid just that. The hundreds of hours on the shooting range under simulated stress conditions paid off when they spotted two pirates with AKs standing right over Jessica, who was crouched on the ground. Sheffield and another SEAL broke away from the formation and both made sure these pirates never kidnapped anyone again with accurate shots. When Sheffield saw the American's bright face, he dove on top of her in the ongoing firefight, shielding her from the enemy crossfire with his own body. More SEALs joined in, and within seconds, the teacher was protected by multiple layers of the world's best warriors. Although the operators themselves all had wives and children, they put the hostage's life above their own. Meanwhile, another comrade had taken care of Paul Thisted, protecting him from enemy fire as well. After all 9 pirates were neutralized and the gunfire stopped, Sheffield put Jessica on his shoulders and sprinted out of the pirate camp as far away from any danger as possible. The other SEALs formed a human shield around the two, ready to resume the fight at any moment. After running as far as his feet would carry him after this energy-sapping battle, Sheffield dropped Jessica off. Pararescue jumpers, the U.S. Air Force's specialized rescue force, tended to the American woman, who still couldn't believe she had just been rescued by her countrymen. As she anxiously asked, "What if more come? More could come." Sheffield coldly replied, "We are SEAL Team 6. We will kill anyone who tries to harm you now." She was visibly reassured by that convincing answer of the bearded warrior who had just rescued her from the worst situation of her life. After the SEALs blew up the pirates' arms depot, they still had to march to the landing zone of the exfiltration helicopter. Whenever a suspicious noise was heard somewhere, or reports of enemies came in over the radio, it took only a few seconds for Jessica to find herself under a layer of Navy SEALs trying to protect her with their own bodies. Fortunately, however, there was no more fighting, and the American, accompanied by the SEALs, ran independently to the Black Hawk that would fly her to freedom. Behind her lay 3 months of captivity among heavily armed pirates, during which she could never be sure that she would live to see the next day. The selfless efforts of the men of SEAL Team 6 had finally saved her. As she reflected on the last few months, one of the soldiers on board knelt beside Jessica, looked her in the eye, handed her a beautifully folded American flag, and said, "Welcome home, Jessica." For those who have made it this far, thanks for watching. If you want to support our...
And that was, the SEAL Team 6 smoking some pirates. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we will continue with Chapter 15 from Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It?
4 of the justices who handed down the Miller decision are regarded as conservatives. The 5th, Justice White, is regarded as middle of the road. On the other hand, Justice Douglas is the most liberal or the most leftward-leaning member of the court. Yet his dissent in the Miller case is an impassioned cry of protest and indignation. He rejects the notion that the First Amendment allows an implied exception in the case of obscenity. I do not think it does, and my views on the issue have been stated over and over again. He declares, obscenity, which even we cannot define with precision, is a hodgepodge. To send men to jail for violating standards they cannot understand, construe, and apply is a monstrous thing to do in a nation dedicated to fair trials and due process. What about the antitrust laws, which are responsible for precisely this kind of monstrous thing? Justice Douglas does not mention them, but antitrust, as we shall see later, is a chicken that comes home to roost on both sides of this issue. On the subject of censorship, however, Justice Douglas is eloquently consistent. The idea that the First Amendment permits punishment for ideas that are offensive to the particular judge or jury sitting in judgment is astounding. No greater leveler of speech or literature has ever been designed. To give the power to the censor, as we do today, is to make a sharp and radical break with the traditions of a free society. The First Amendment was not fashioned as a vehicle for dispensing tranquilizers to the people. Its prime function was to keep debate open to offensive, as well as to staid people. The tendency throughout history has been to subdue the individual and to exalt the power of government. The use of the standard offensive gives authority to government that cuts the very vitals out of the First Amendment. As is intimated by the court's opinion, the materials before us may be garbage, but so is much of what is said in political campaigns, in the daily press, on TV or over the radio. By reason of the First Amendment, and solely because of it, speakers and publishers have not been threatened or subdued because their thoughts and ideas may be offensive to some. I can only say amen to this statement. Observe that such issues as the individual against the state are never mentioned in the Supreme Court's majority decision. It is Justice Douglas, the arch-liberal, who defends individual rights. It is the conservatives who speak as if the individual did not exist, as if the unit of social concern were the collective, the community. A profound commitment to moral collectivism does not occur in a vacuum, as a causeless primary. It requires an epistemological foundation. The Supreme Court's majority decision in the case of Paris Adult Theater 1 versus Slatton reveals that foundation.
And I want to interrupt real quick because what Ayn Rand is talking about here is government rights. She talks about pornography and obscenity, and then she also mentions antitrust. And so what you end up with here is the left supports government rights when it comes to the right to prevent monopolies. The conservatives believe in the right of government to prevent or do away with pornography. So you can see how that sets up. In this particular case, it's interesting that, as she said, it is the Democrat that ends up being on the side of the individual, and it is the Republican who ends up being on the side of the government. But again, everybody in the country believes the government has rights. The only question is the right to do what? If you're talking about people like Sean Hannity, they believe in the right to arrest, the right to convict, the right to incarcerate, the right to go to war. And when you're talking about Democrats, today's Democrats, you're talking about all the rights that we know that they think the government has, the right to decide to, usually for the Democrats, to eliminate various things. The government has the right to eliminate racism, transphobia, etc. So back to the story.
This case involves 2 movie theaters in Atlanta, Georgia, which exhibited allegedly obscene films, admitting only adults. The local trial court ruled that this was constitutionally permissible, but the Georgia Supreme Court reversed the decision on the grounds that hardcore pornography is not protected by the First Amendment. Thus, the issue before the U.S. Supreme Court was whether it is constitutional to abridge the freedom of consenting adults. The court's majority decision said yes. Epistemologically, this decision is a proclamation of non-objectivity. It supports and defends explicitly the most evil of social phenomena, non-objective law. The decision, written by Chief Justice Burger, declares, "We hold that there are legitimate state interests at stake in stemming the tide of commercialized obscenity. These include the interest of the public in the quality of life and the total community environment, the tone of commerce in the great city centers, and possibly the public safety itself." Try to find a single issue or action that would be exempt from this kind of legitimate state interest. Quoting a book by Professor Bickel, the decision declares, "A man may be entitled to read an obscene book in his room, but if he demands a right to obtain the books and pictures he wants in the market, then to grant him his right is to affect the world about the rest of us, and to impinge on other privacies. What is commonly read and seen and heard and done intrudes upon us all, want it or not." Which kind of human activity would be exempt from a declaration of this kind? And what advocate of a totalitarian dictatorship would not endorse that declaration? Mr. Berger concedes that there is no scientific data which conclusively demonstrates that exposure to obscene materials adversely affects men and women or their society, but he rejects this as an argument against the suppression of such materials. And there follows an avalanche of statements and of quotations from earlier court decisions, all claiming, in terms broader than the issue of pornography, that scientific knowledge and conclusive proof are not required as a basis for legislation, that the state has the right to enact laws on the grounds of what does or might exist. Scientific data, in the proper literal sense of these words, means knowledge of reality, reached by a process of reason, and conclusive demonstration means that the content of a given proposition is proved to be a fact of reality. It is reason and reality that are here being removed as a limitation on the power of the state. It is the right to legislate on the basis of any assumption, any hypothesis, any guess, any feeling, any whim, on any grounds or none, that is here being conferred on the government. We do not demand of legislatures scientifically certain criteria of legislation, the decision affirms. Although there is no conclusive proof of a connection between antisocial behavior and obscene material, the legislature of Georgia could quite reasonably determine that such a connection does or might exist. In deciding Roth, the court implicitly accepted that a legislature could legitimately act on such a conclusion to protect the social interest in order and morality. If the notion that something might be a threat to the social interest is sufficient to justify suppression, then the Nazi or the Soviet dictatorship is justified in exterminating anyone who, in its belief, might be a threat to the social interest of the Nazi or the Soviet community. Whatever theory of government such a notion represents, it is not the theory of America's founding fathers. Strangely enough, Chief Justice Burger seems to be aware of it because he proceeds to call on a pre-American precedent. From the beginning of civilized societies, legislators and judges have acted on various unprovable assumptions. Such assumptions underlie much lawful state regulation of commercial and business affairs. This is preeminently true. And look at the results. Look at the history of all the governments in the world prior to the birth of the United States. Ours was the first government based on and strictly limited by a written document, the Constitution, which specifically forbids it to violate individuals' rights or to act on whim. The history of the atrocities perpetrated by all the other kinds of governments, unrestricted governments acting on unprovable assumptions, demonstrates the value and validity of the original political theory on which this country was built. Yet here is the Supreme Court, citing all those bloody millennia of tyranny as a precedent for us to follow. If this seems inexplicable, the very next sentence of Mr. Berger's decision gives a clue to the reasons, and a violently clear demonstration of the role of precedent in the development of law. The next sentence seems to unleash a whirling storm of feathers as chickens come flying home from every direction to roost on everyone's coop, perch, or fence, in retribution for every evasion, compromise, injustice, and violation of rights perpetrated in past decades. That next sentence is: the same, a basis of unprovable assumptions, is true of the federal securities, antitrust laws, and a host of other federal regulations. Formally, I would have to say, "Oh, Mr. Chief Justice." Informally, I want to say, "Oh, brother." On the basis of these assumptions, Mr. Berger goes on, both Congress and the state legislatures have, for example, drastically restricted associational rights by adopting antitrust laws, and have strictly regulated public expression by issuers of and dealers in securities, profit-sharing coupons, and trading stamps, commanding what they must and may not publish and announce. Understandably, those who entertain an absolutist view of the First Amendment find it uncomfortable to explain why rights of association, speech, and press should be severely restrained in the marketplace of goods and money, but not in the marketplace of pornography. On the collectivist premise, there is, of course, no answer. The only answer in today's situation is to check that premise and reject it, and start repealing all those catastrophically destructive violations of individual rights and of the Constitution. But this is not what the court majority has decided. Forgetting his own warning about the gestative propensity of the judicial and legislative processes, Chief Justice Berger accepts the precedent as an irrevocable absolute and pushes the country many steps further toward the abyss of statism. Likewise, the decision continues, when legislatures and administrators act to protect the physical environment from pollution and to preserve our resources of forests, streams, and parks, they must act on such imponderables as the impact of a new highway near or through an existing park or wilderness area. Thus, the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1968 and the Department of Transportation Act in 1966 have been described by Mr. Justice Black as a solemn determination of the highest lawmaking body of this nation that beauty and health-giving facilities of our parks are not to be taken away for public roads without hearings, fact findings, and policy determinations under the supervision of a cabinet officer. The fact that a congressional directive reflects unprovable assumptions about what is good for the people, including imponderable aesthetic assumptions, is not a sufficient reason to find that statute unconstitutional. Isn't it? If it is not, then the imponderable aesthetic assumptions of government officials are entitled to invade the field of literature and art, as Mr. Berger's decision is inviting them to do. The ugly hand of altruism slithers into the decision, in a passage that sideswipes the concept of free will. We have just noted, for example, that neither the First Amendment nor free will precludes states from having blue sky laws to regulate what sellers of securities may write or publish about their wares. Such laws are to protect the weak, the uninformed, the unsuspecting, and the gullible from the exercise of their own volition. It is for this kind of purpose that the rest of us, who are not weak, uninformed, unsuspecting, and gullible, are to be protected from our volition and deprived of the right to exercise it. So much for the relation of altruism to rights and to freedom. Here is another chicken flying home. States are told by some that they must await a laissez-faire market solution to the obscenity pornography problem. Paradoxically, by people who have never otherwise had a kind word to say for laissez-faire, particularly in solving urban, commercial, and environmental pollution problems. The decision contains many other homing chickens of this kind, an entire barnyard of them, many more than I have space to quote. But these are sufficient to give you the nature, style, and spirit of that ruling. In his dissenting opinion, Justice Brennan, joined by Justice Stewart and Marshall, offers some good arguments to support the conclusion that censorship in regard to consenting adults is unconstitutional. But he wavers, hesitates to go that far, and tries to compromise, to strike a better balance between the guarantee of free expression and the state's legitimate interests. He concedes the notion that obscene material is not protected by the First Amendment, but expresses an anxious concern over the court's failure to draw a clear line between protected and unprotected speech. He cites the chaotic, contradictory record of the court's decision in obscenity cases, but sidesteps the issue by saying in a footnote, "Whether or not a class of obscene, and thus entirely unprotected speech does exist, I am forced to concede that the class is incapable of definition, with sufficient clarity to withstand attack on vagueness grounds. Accordingly, it is on principles of the void for vagueness doctrine that this opinion exclusively relies." Justice Brennan speaks eloquently about the danger of vague laws and quotes Chief Justice Warren, who said that the constitutional requirement of definiteness is violated by a criminal statute that fails to give a person of ordinary intelligence fair notice that his contemplated conduct is forbidden by the statute. But Justice Brennan does not mention the antitrust laws, which do just that. He states, "The resulting level of uncertainty is utterly intolerable, not alone because it makes bookselling a hazardous profession, but as well because it invites arbitrary and erratic enforcement of the law." He deplores the fact that obscenity judgments are now made on a case-by-case, site-by-site basis. He observes that the court has been struggling to fend off attempts to pass to the courts, and ultimately to the Supreme Court, the awesome task of making case-by-case at once the criminal and the constitutional law. But he does not mention the living hell of antitrust, the grim monument to law made case-by-case. However, a greater respect for principles and a greater understanding of their consequences are revealed in Justice Brennan's dissenting opinion than in the majority decision. He declares that on the basis of that majority decision, it is hard to see how state-ordered regimentation of our minds can ever be forestalled. For if a state may, in an effort to maintain or create a particular moral tone, prescribe what its citizens cannot read or cannot see, then it would seem to follow that in pursuit of that same objective, a state could decree that its citizens must read certain books or must view certain films. The best statement, however, is made again by Justice Douglas, who ends his forceful dissent with the words, "But our society, unlike most of the world, presupposes that freedom and liberty are in a frame of reference that make the individual, not government, the keeper of his tastes, beliefs, and ideas. That is the philosophy of the First Amendment, and it is the article of faith that sets us apart from most nations in the world." I concur, except that it is not an article of faith, but a provable, rational conviction. In the life of a nation, The law plays the same role as a decision-making process of thought does in the life of an individual. An individual makes decisions by applying his basic premises to a specific choice, premises which he can change, but seldom does. The basic premises of a nation's laws are set by its dominant political philosophy and implemented by the courts, whose task is to determine the application of broad principles to specific cases. In this task, the equivalent of basic premises is precedent, which can be challenged but seldom is. How far a loosely worded piece of legislation can go in the role of precedent is horrifyingly demonstrated by the Supreme Court's majority decision in another one of the 5 obscenity cases, U.S. versus Orito. This case involves a man charged with knowingly transporting obscene material by common carrier in interstate commerce. The clause giving Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce is one of the major errors in the Constitution. That clause, more than any other, was the crack in the Constitution's foundation, the entering wedge of statism, which permits the gradual establishment of the welfare state. But I would venture to say that the framers of the Constitution could not have conceived of what that clause has now become. If, in writing it, one of their goals was to facilitate the flow of trade and prevent the establishment of trade barriers among the states, that clause has reached the opposite destination. You may now expect 50 different frontiers inside this country, with customs officials searching your luggage, and pockets for books or magazines permitted in one state, but prohibited in another. Chief Justice Berger's decision declares, quoting an earlier court decision, "The motive and purpose of a regulation of interstate commerce are matters for the legislative judgment upon the exercise of which the Constitution places no restriction and over which the courts are given no control."
And that was the next section of Chapter 15 from Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.